In 1959, a 9-year-old girl disappeared while selling mints. For 62 years, no one knew what happened. Detectives chased the wrong leads, the wrong suspects, until one small glass jar changed everything. Inside it was a clue that would solve the case decades later. On a cold Friday afternoon in March 1959, a 9-year-old girl stepped out of her home in Spokane, Washington, carrying a small box of candy. Her name was Candice, or Candy, Rogers. She was part of a school fundraiser, going door to door selling mint candies to neighbors. It was the kind of activity that felt normal at the time, safe, routine, something children did without fear. Candy never came home. At first, there was no immediate panic. She had likely gone to a few houses nearby. Maybe she stayed out a little longer than expected. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, concern turned into fear. Her family started searching. Neighbors joined in. Soon, the police were called. What began as a missing child report quickly escalated into one of the most haunting cases in the history of Spokane. Search teams spread across the area. Volunteers combed through neighborhoods, fields, and wooded areas. Flyers were distributed. The entire community seemed to pause, united by a single question. Where was Candy Rogers? Then, days later, the search came to a devastating end. Her body was discovered in a remote area near the city. The details were disturbing. It was clear that this was not an accident. This was a crime. And just like that, Spokane was no longer searching for a missing girl. They were searching for a killer. In the early days of the investigation, detectives worked with the tools they had at the time: witness statements, physical evidence, and intuition. They interviewed neighbors. They questioned known offenders. They followed leads that seemed promising. But again and again, the trail went cold. The case quickly became complicated. There were suspects, there were theories, but nothing that could definitively identify the person responsible. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case remained unsolved. For the community, the impact was profound. Parents became more cautious. Children were no longer sent out alone the way they once were. The sense of safety that had existed before that day in March had been permanently altered. But for investigators, the case was far from over. Over the decades, the investigation continued. Different detectives took over the case, each bringing new ideas and new perspectives. They revisited old evidence. They re-interviewed witnesses. They explored new leads that had not been available in the early years. But there was one problem: the evidence. In 1959, forensic science was limited. DNA testing did not exist. Many of the techniques used today were still decades away from being developed. This meant that even if evidence had been collected at the time, there was no way to fully analyze it. Or so it seemed, because somewhere, quietly preserved and almost forgotten, a small piece of evidence had survived. Inside a small glass mason jar. The jar contained biological material collected during the original investigation. At the time, it had little use, but an unknown investigator had made the decision to preserve it rather than discard it. They sealed it, stored it, and moved on with the case. They had no way of knowing that decades later, that simple decision would change everything. As time passed, the case of Candice Rogers became a cold case, one of many unsolved mysteries filed away in police archives, but it was never forgotten. Generations of detectives returned to it, each hoping to be the one to finally find the answer. Then, more than 60 years later, something changed. Advancements in forensic science had made it possible to analyze DNA in ways that were unimaginable in 1959. Even degraded samples could now be tested and compared against modern databases. Investigators decided to reopen the case. They went back to the evidence. They examined everything that had been preserved, and eventually they rediscovered the mason jar. Inside it was a clue that had been waiting for decades. The material was sent for DNA analysis. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable breakthroughs in the history of forensic science. The DNA profile that was extracted was compared against databases. At first, there was no direct match, but investigators didn't stop there. They used a method known as genetic genealogy, which allows scientists to identify potential relatives of an unknown individual by analyzing shared DNA. This process is complex. It involves building family trees, tracing connections, and narrowing down possibilities across generations. It requires time, expertise, and patience. But slowly, a picture began to form. The DNA pointed towards a specific family line. From there, investigators worked to identify individuals within that family who could have been connected to the crime. They analyzed timelines, locations, and other evidence. Eventually, they narrowed it down to one person, a man who had lived in Spokane at the time of the crime, a man who had never been publicly identified as a suspect, a man who, by the time he was identified, was already dead. But even though he was no longer alive, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA match was described as a 25 quintillion to 1 probability. To put that into perspective, it is a number so large that it is almost impossible to comprehend. It means that the likelihood of the DNA belonging to anyone else was essentially zero. After 62 years, the case was finally solved. The identity of the killer was revealed. For the family of Candice Rogers, the news brought a sense of closure that had been out of reach for decades. The mystery that had haunted them for so long was finally answered. For the city of Spokane, it marked the end of one of its darkest chapters. And for investigators, it was a reminder of something important. Sometimes the truth isn't lost. It's just waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the right technology. Waiting for someone to look at it again. The story of this case is not just about a crime. It's about time. It's about the persistence of those who refuse to give up. And it's about a small, seemingly insignificant decision made decades ago to preserve a piece of evidence in a glass jar. That decision, made without knowing its future impact, ultimately led to justice. More than 60 decades after a young girl stepped out to sell candy and never returned, the clock finally stopped, and the truth was finally revealed.